Kept away from you today. Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting in a second. Winston has managed to find himself doing. If you need to use the bathroom, the toilets are directly opposite us on the other side of the cafe. So you just walk out to this door, walk straight along. If for any reason the fire alarm should go, the exits are through the doors here on our left-hand side. So literally just push the bars straight out into the car park. My name is Jean Evely. I have been asked to chair the meeting today on behalf of Newham Transport Action Group and Transport for All, who are the organisations that have arranged this meeting. I would like to thank our candidates for attending. We have Samir Giselle, who is representing the Conservative Party for East Ham. We have Paul Reynolds, who is representing the Liberal Democrats for West Ham, because unfortunately his colleague couldn't attend today. We have Rachel Collinson representing the Green Party, also for West Ham. And we have Stephen Teams, who is our current sitting MP for East Ham, representing the Labour Party. So, the election is just under a month away, so hopefully talking to these four representatives today will give you a good idea of who you would like to vote for if you're still undecided, possibly change your mind if you're not, or confirm what you already suspected as well. So I will give everybody 5 minutes to introduce themselves, and then I will open the floor to questions. I do have to remind you all that these four candidates have very generously given up their time, and although you may not agree with everything that they've said, please be polite and respectful, otherwise I will have to vacate you from the room. Thank you very much. Who would like to start? Left to right, right to left?
CTMP.
I'm happy to start. Would you like me, Jean, to talk specifically about transport or some other disability issues as well?
The way the agenda is set out at the moment, if you just give a general introduction to start with,
okay.
And then we've broken down into 5 sections, so you'll get specific questions on health and social care, education, transport, and then we've got an open free-for-all at the end to cover all other points.
Okay, smashing. Well, thank you first of all very much for hosting this event and giving us this opportunity. We published our party manifesto on Monday, and I think most of the manifestos have now been published, and ours committed us in the Labour Party always, is quoting the wording in the manifesto, to treat sick and disabled people with dignity. So the first thing we want to do is to scrap the bedroom tax. And so lift a source of fear and hardship which has been hanging over 400,000 households ever since it was introduced, 400,000 households with a disabled person living in them who should never have been subjected to the bedroom tax in the first place. I think it's an awful measure, and getting rid of it will be our number one priority. I think one of the things that's gone wrong over the last few years is a real failure to listen properly to what disabled people have been saying to politicians. And so our Disability Manifesto, which is going to be published next Monday, will commit to a consultative committee involving both ministers from across government and also representatives of disabled people themselves, meeting regularly, so that ministers can listen properly to and understand the concerns that disabled people are raising about the things that are going on, and listen to their ideas for improvement. I mean, one very important priority has to be to sort out the shambles with PIP, the personal independence payment, I was speaking to somebody this morning who applied 21 months ago for PIP and it still hasn't been resolved. I mean, it really has been a terrible, terrible shambles. And a lot of people who used to receive disability living allowance are now extremely worried and don't know what's going to happen to them. That mess needs to be sorted out as a top priority. We want to reform the work capability assessment, and I can talk perhaps in a bit more detail if we get some top discussion about this, about what we'll do to the work capability assessment. But the other thing we want to do is to change the government's work programme, which has been a particular failure for people on employment and support allowance, people out of work on health grounds, fewer than 10% of whom have got a sustained job out of the work programme. So what we want to do is take people on ESA, other than people with just a 6-month prognosis, 6 months or less, take them out of the work programme and set up a new programme which we would roll the current work choice programme into as well. Apologies for all the jargon here, but a new programme which is committed to helping and supporting disabled people into work. And we want that programme to work much more closely with local authorities and other local agencies in a way that the work programme certainly hasn't done, to, we think, do a much better job of supporting disabled people who are able to work, to get into employment and to build for themselves a good future as a result. We think there's a number of other things we need to do with access to work, for example, and no doubt a whole host of issues will be raised in our discussions today. But I suppose the central point I would make is that we have to ensure that people with disabilities are able to play an absolutely full part in the economic life and the social life of our community. And I think we do need to make some quite big changes to enable that to happen.
Thank you. Rachel?
So, thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a varied audience here. So, I live in Stratford in West Ham, and the reason I joined the Green Party was because I am fed up of disabled people being left out in the cold, not just by the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, but Labour as well. I think that we need proper funding for health, social care, we need proper funding for the NHS, and we need to renationalise our public transport system, because what we've seen as privatisation is rolled out across the country is that disabled people get left behind in the rush towards profit. So I came here today on the Docklands Light Railway from Stratford, and I saw no staff at the majority of the stations that I travelled through. And I think this is wrong. I think that Transport for London is being gradually taken to pieces, starting with PFIs under Labour 15 years ago, and continuing under a Conservative and Lib Dem coalition. We're just about to see ticket offices closing and 1,000 people being made redundant. I don't want that to happen. If I were elected, I would fight together with my Green colleagues on the London Assembly to reverse those cuts and provide proper funding for public transport that is accessible to all. In the Green Party manifesto, we want to see a person-centred approach to disability, and we want to treat disabled people and elderly, and particularly disabled children, with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And one of the ways that we need to do this is through inclusive education. So what we want to do is we want to bring back control of education to local authorities, and instead of bureaucrats from Ofsted coming and assessing schools and provision for disabled children, we will have teachers and parents assessing the school's suitability for disabled children, with a view to including everyone and making them all contributing members of society. Finally, we are against pushing people into work. We believe that disabled people are willing to work when they are ready, and we would end the travesty of private contractors assessing people's suitability to work. We believe that this is wrong because those private contractors are judged by the money they make for the government and not by how they respect people who are in desperate situations most of the time. So we would give back control to GPs and healthcare professionals who really understand the disabilities that they are assessing in order to say whether a person is fit for work or not. So I hope you'll consider voting Green in both in East Ham or West Ham at the general election in May. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me here, and congratulations to for in particular for their campaign, which is raising issues in people's minds which are not raised sufficiently enough. So thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for coming along. I want to just talk about two things. One is I want to talk about priorities. For those people who have a disability, be it temporary or permanent, there are difficulties people find in attitude in institutions, where you find, for example, even when Crossrail is being built, there had to be pressure put on the authorities even to provide step-free access to Crossrail. There had to be campaigning to just get them to concede on that. And I think it's the same in education. In education, there's another issue, which is how do people learn about people with disability? It's by having people with disability as their friends at school. And these are important factors in dealing with the problems over the longer term. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Transport for London approach to disability. It's I used to live in Japan, and it's when you use the transport system in Tokyo, when you come to London, it's utterly shocking how difficult it is for people to get around. And sometimes it's kind of therapeutic for people who are not disabled, to break a bone in their foot and see how difficult it is to get around the tube system, for example, and on buses. And one thing I find really quite extraordinary, thanks to Caroline Vision on the Lib Dem member on the GLA, we uncovered this debacle at Shepherd's Bush tube station where £39 million was spent by TFL trying to create step-free access in Shepherd's Bush station. They didn't complete the project. There's still no step-free access. Can you imagine the amount of money? Only £75 million has been allocated at TFL for providing better disability access at tube stations and in London transport generally, in buses and so on, and network rail. I mean, 75. I mean, if you go by the Shepherd's Bush example, it might pay for 2.5 stations to be upgraded to step-free access. It's utterly appalling. Our approach to dealing with this problem is, first of all, the technical approaches to providing step-free access to tube stations is utterly lamentable. There's just not enough money to provide a lift at every station in old Victorian stations. I mean, millions, but there are other ways of doing it, and we'll talk about it in the discussion stage. But the other issue is that the stations themselves, many of these old Victorian stations, are worth zillions, and they're not developed, the money's not put into the stations on an individual station-by-station basis. So just using transport as an example, you can really see how the thinking, I mean, the people at TFL, and how the finances are organised, you can be pretty sure that they did not have disabled friends at school. So we'll talk about some detail in a moment, but I just wanted to introduce with that particular example.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. As you know, I'm standing in East Ham, and throughout the debate today we're going to be discussing various the various elements and the issues associated with disability within the transport system, in particular in London. But let me give you a brief background as to why I think that you should be backing the Conservative Party, and all of this will kind of sink in as we get along further on in the debate. I mean, overall, any changes we wish to make, any investment we wish to make, all hinges on one thing, and that is a strong economy, and not a debt-ridden economy. You know, if we're going to pledge money into services, if we're going to pledge money into infrastructure and investment, which we have done, you know, as I said throughout the debate, we'll talk a bit more about what we have pledged and what we will be putting in, but that hinges on us actually being able to have some money in the bank to realistically not just sit here and say, right, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we've got no means to pay for it. But the reality is we need a strong plan and a strong economy to do so. Whether that means we're going to be putting money into the NHS for services that affect disabled people in terms of the health service, or whether that be in the transport sector, that is what we are planning to do, and we've delivered our manifesto yesterday, and what we plan is to keep this economy going, keep it stable. We haven't finished what we started. We've only managed to halve the 3 trillion which was left by Stephen's party in 2010, and we've got a long way to go. But the reality is, and a lot of the smaller parties will always tell you, we can do this, and we can wave the magic wand and eradicate all the problems. But the reality is, it needs to be hinged on the economy working well, and that's what we want in the Conservative Party. We want us to finish the job that we've started, and we have, if we look at numbers of disabled people that are back into work, they're higher post 2010 than pre. We haven't finished the job. We don't think that it's an ideal situation. There are other stations that need, for example, say by 2020, our target is to make all rail vehicles accessible for disabled people. There is still a long way to go. We are far off it, but we're doing our best with the circumstances and the means that we have. The one thing I would always urge you is when voting, and I'm sure no one, I don't doubt anyone's intention or goodwill that is sat at the table, be it from the Green Party or the Liberal Democrats or Labour, but the difficulties of actually being in government and the realities of what you can spend and what you can invest in and the amounts you can invest in, only those parties in government know that. And I think the Lib Dems got a taste of that, and they saw that with their tuition fees debacle, where they just could not hold to promises. And that's just an example of the reality. What we've managed to do is to keep on top of our promises. We've tried to, I know we plan to actually eliminate the deficit, but when you're left with £3 trillion worth of it, and you find out a lot more when you're in office, and you find notes saying that there is actually no money left, sometimes things do take a bit longer. So the best will in the world, we've tried to do that. But we'll talk on about some more further in-depth issues as we go along. But that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As has been alluded to, we have got quite a packed agenda to get through today. We're going to break down the discussion areas into the following sections. We have health and social care first, so that will cover your GPs, NHS, social services, etc. And then we'll move on to education, and we have a speaker from the Alliance for Inclusive Education, I believe, here to give us a brief introduction first when we get to that section. We will then have transport, and we have Freya from Transport for All to actually introduce that section for us. We will then move on to benefits, and then we'll open the floor for a free-for-all discussion for any remaining time. I would like to get everybody on the panel to have the chance to answer all the questions, so I am going to limit you to 3 minutes per answer for each question so that we can get through as many as possible. Okay? So our first section is health and social care. Angus?
There was an announcement this morning that about a third of GPs are planning to retire or move abroad in the next 5 years. So I'll make it short. I'd like people to address how they would plan to deal with the lack of GP numbers, especially in boroughs like Durham, and how we can find a new way of employing GPs
And
rather.
would you like that to be specifically about GPs, or are we able to widen it to include nurses and doctors within the wider NHS? That
I'm
have to be-
thinking specifically of GPs, but we can address wider issues as
So
well.
if you would like to address the GPs first, and then you can follow on with the wider NHS.
Shall I start?
Yep.
Well, I think this is a really big issue, and I was speaking to somebody in East Ham High Street this morning who needs to see their GP and cannot get an appointment. I mean, people say they have to wait a fortnight, they have to wait 3 weeks. This guy simply has been unable to get an appointment at all. And this is getting worse and worse and worse. And we are committed to the target that anyone should be able to see their GP within 48 hours. And as you rightly say, that is going to require a big investment in recruiting doctors. So our central proposal on this is that we will introduce a mansion tax on homes that are worth more than £2 million. I suspect probably nobody here has a home worth more than £2 million, but you never know. And that will raise for us £2.5 billion a year, and that will enable us, we think, to recruit an extra 8,000 GPs and also 20,000 doctors in order to deal with some of these pressures. And what we're calling that is our time to care fund, because I think that's the problem at the moment. People in the health service just don't have the time to care. They're run absolutely ragged. And there's got to be better resourcing, and we think the mansion tax is the way to provide it. Samir referred to the fact he was frank enough to admit that the government, having said they were going to eliminate the deficit in this Parliament, of actually bearing hard the deficit. And Samir suggested that was because once they got into office they discovered things weren't what they thought. Well, actually it was after the election. David Cameron, I remember, standing up in Parliament and telling us they were going to eliminate the deficit in this Parliament. Alistair Darling's plan was to halve it, and David Cameron at the time described that as woefully inadequate. But now they're asking us to congratulate them on having halved the deficit, which they described as woefully. Anyway, because of their failure on that, that does mean there are serious constraints ahead. And this week, the Conservatives have said they're going to fund £8 billion for the health service from future growth. Well, of course, future growth was how they were going to pay off the deficit in one Parliament, and sadly that didn't work, so I'm afraid the plan to get the £8 billion for the health service isn't going to work either. No, what's necessary is a clear source of funding, and that is what the mentioned tax will give us, £2.5 billion a year. It will help us to start at least addressing exactly the problems you described.
Rachel?
So, I don't know about you, but I fear for the future of our NHS. I really, really do. I'm worried that most of the major parties will not give it the funding that it desperately needs. Not only that, but they are not supporting the Green MP Caroline Lucas's NHS reinstatement bill. We've been lucky enough to have a handful of Labour MPs support the bill, but the majority of MPs are against this. All that bill would do would be to reverse the marketisation of the NHS, whereby the profit motive is supposed to give us the services that we all need and want. However, what we're seeing is when private companies get hold of hospitals, they realise there's no profit in it. They mess up the hospital and then they hand it back. We need to remove all profit from the NHS. And I think what we're seeing is doctors reacting to this situation where profit is king above the people. And I sympathise with doctors in that. I wouldn't want to meet arbitrary targets working with private companies who care about their shareholders and not the people they're supposed to treat. So the Green Party has a plan to roll back all privatisation of healthcare which would actually bring in £10 billion, because that is what we are paying in order to have this system of markets within the NHS. That would provide plenty of money towards doctors being paid properly, having decent hours, and nurses. Nurses are so important, and they're being treated shamefully by the managers in the NHS. So what we'd like to do is ensure that the doctors and nurses, that we listen to them, and what they say goes. Not managers, not shareholders, not executive directors of private companies, but the actual health professionals and the patients themselves about what they want to see happen in the NHS. And I'm pretty sure that the majority of people in this country want to see the NHS returned to us, the people, because it's us that get ill, it's us that get stressed, it's us that have mental health problems. And so I'm very proud to support the Green Party in bringing back the dignity and the satisfaction of being a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare support worker in the NHS.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, on the sort of national policy stuff, I'm not going to sort of run off and talk about deficit fiscal thingies. But on the overall NHS spending, as you know, the Liberal Democrats have committed an extra $8 billion for the NHS, hurriedly followed by an unfunded pledge from the Conservative Party on the same thing. But the question is a very good one. I mean, how is it that in some parts of London, I mean, for example, where I live, you can get an GP appointment quite easily on the same day, whereas in the place I used to live, in other parts of London, you were lucky to get an appointment within 3 weeks. So there's a sort of, the current system has created a kind of postcode lottery. You're absolutely right about that. But it's up to the politicians, people like myself, to solve the problem rather than pointing the finger at others. And we are, after all, a public service to you. And I think that in order to address the problem, we have to remember, first of all, that GP practices are private businesses. They are part of the NHS system, but they're not legally part of the NHS. And let us not forget that the NHS, the GP service deal, which was probably very poorly negotiated 6 or 7 years ago, has provided really quite extraordinary income from some GPs. I mean, some husband and wife teams around the country are having income of in excess of £250,000 a year. So there was an interesting question: how come, if the GPs are paid such large sums of money, how come there's such a shortage? And part of the difficulty is that the way that GPs are educated and trained into the health system in the UK is highly restricted. And if we don't deal with that problem, we're going to have shortages of GPs, until we're all on our deathbeds. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. And we have to, from a practical point of view, we have to address the question of the training and education system for medics in this country. Of course, as you know, a large number of GPs, especially in this part of London, come from overseas and were trained overseas and provide a good service. But it doesn't get away from the fact that we have a shortage and we have long waiting lists. We have to deal with that problem. So it's the medical system as a whole, the education and training system does make a difference. There's hardly a shortage of cash. Some people are being paid $250,000 a year to be a GP. It's not all paid that amount of money, but you understand the general problem. The other thing I want to mention about this is the difficulty in the distinction between private and public. And we've all experienced it. I've been to hospitals in the UK and I've been to A&E, where you can kind of go downstairs in the same NHS hospital and jump the queue by paying a large sum of money for private care. This happened to me. I was actually a broken limb and had to go to A&E after skating foolishly in the winter. And there was a screen in the A&E waiting room saying, jump the queue and go private. a screen inside the waiting room. I've been waiting there for 6 hours to be seen 2 broken limbs. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. The difficulty is that it's very hard to know where the resources are going, because when I had for my company, I had medical insurance at one point from a company. I went to the hospital, and then I went downstairs to the private bit and saw the same doctor that I would have seen upstairs. Yes, but he saw me immediately, as opposed to waiting 3 months or 4 months. I mean, we've got to sort these problems out. It's not just a question of how much money one puts into the system, where it does need more money, of course, because of population growth and so on. But there are systemic issues here in the health system that we have to address. And if we don't address them, and if we make the NHS a kind of political ping pong, what he said, well, we're never going to solve them. We have to deal with the systemic problems as they exist. And they're really not. I mean, the questions of how much GPs are paid and what the contracts are like, really, it's not so much of a sort of ideological argument. It's more a management and professional one. But if we don't sort those problems out, the systemic problems, we're going to have the same problems 40 years from now, notwithstanding all the promises from the politicians.
Picking up one of your last points, I'm glad you've talked about not making this a political ping pong, because actually it was only a couple of months ago when Ed Miliband was caught out red-handed trying to politicise, in his own words, the NHS, which to all of us and to people who use the NHS a lot is a disgusting record. And let's be very clear about the reality of what Labour left us with. And it's not just about the situation the NHS was left in. It was about the culture of cover-up, the inability. Doctors and nurses was too scared to actually come out and talk about what was happening. I mean, in the mid-staff crisis, we had patients drinking out of flower vases. Too scared, the nurses and doctors were, to come out and actually, tell the truth of what's going on. So our record is that we've protected the £12.9 billion, which we promised, into the NHS. And when we talk about us saying that, again, we do need to, I'm not going to sit here and paint the rosiest picture ever and say that everything's great. I mean, I was in hospital the other day, I had a car accident, and I'm sure things could be a lot better, and I know things will be a lot better if we put what Simon Stevens has asked for, which is the $8 billion, to get the NHS back on its feet, and if we can implement that, I'm sure we'll be a lot better. But, again, where does the $8 billion come from? The Green Party talk about, their plans. The Green Party are in control in Brighton. They talk about, the biggest issue is the environment. They've got the worst recycling rates in the country. Let's put things into perspective. The mansion tax we're told about using to pay this, well, the mansion tax has been quoted, I think, 3 or 4 times to pay for 3 or 4 different things. What we're saying,
This isn't answering the question about
which one I'm coming to now, which is about the funding for that. So the reality is that we need the funding. Now, what we've said, and don't forget, it was under Labour that you lost the chance to actually know who your personal GP was, and that's something that we are planning to bring back in. We want you to know who your GP is, because I've got 2 young kids, and I know it's horrible having to ring up and trying to work out. I mean, it's awful. I ring the nursery up and I don't know who the kid's GP is. And what we've pledged, by 2020, having put the money back into the economy, projected on what we've saved and the monies that we've created and saved during this Parliament, everyone over 75 will be guaranteed a GP's appointment on the same day, and between 24 to 48 hours, we're edging towards 24 is our aim, but we want to be very realistic, but within 48 hours, we want people to be able to have an appointment with a named GP. And that's what's needed, because what's going on at the minute, I mean, I sometimes have to wait you ring up with the flu or something and you have to wait 2 weeks, you're told it's a 2 weeks wait, and if you've got kids, it's not, it's just not ideal and it's not possible. One of the things we have done, and one of the things that we do encourage, is multiple GP practices where you have named doctors. There are a number of them there which are open for a number of hours, which then eases the pressure on A&E. But again, all this hinges on us having the right amount of money. The 8 billion which we've pledged, we feel will be enough to then make sure that everyone over 75 gets a same-day appointment, and between 24 to 48 hours, every other person with a named named GP, you'll be able to get your appointment.
Thank you. The lady on the second row in the blue shirts. Yes.
Me?
Yes, yes.
I have to tell you my name, I'm Joyce. I don't know which of you would address a particular issue. I know Mr. Stevens said something about the social, your focus or your interest with this group is social care, adult social care. Am I right?
I don't think I mentioned that, but it is. I mean, one of the things that we've been arguing for is integrating the health service with social care. So, yes.
For some time, or at least for a year and a half now, or 2 years, there's been a progressive increase in the contribution that disabled people or elderly make into the care that they receive. It was a big discussion backwards and forwards, 2012 I think or so, and finally it was in a forum of the older people's reference group that I attend that Lynn Brown, I never met her before that time, picked me up on one of the questions I asked, and she came to my help in the end, and it was very helpful. She managed to get a good part of the bill that I was facing scrapped, which I appreciated. But thereafter, after about another year, it's a progressive. You find that your allowance, your disability, not the disability, whatever contribution or whatever money government gives you, increases by about £3 or £4 per month or per 4 weeks. And then the contribution I'm being asked to make now is about £6. So it eats up the increase. Whereas I'm happy to contribute towards my care, if this is what the economy is facing just now, I'm quite happy. Well, I think a good number of us are happy to contribute. But the progression is a little bit stiff, and it makes you wonder. At one point I was talking to another friend who said, let government give us this money. I know I have to make the point, because I don't know which of the members they will pick it up. It's important to know, instead of giving it in one hand and taking it up at the drawboard, or say that you elderly will get £10 a week or a month, from which you already deducted the care for that month. It might be better. It made the blow a little bit softer to take. Thank you.
Okay. So the question is about the annual increase in disability and pensioners' benefits, and the fact that a higher proportion than is handed out is actually taken back to pay for social care.
Towards the social
I know
care.
that in some of the boroughs within London, and certainly in some of the other areas in the country, up to 75% of your disability living allowance in total can now be taken off you to pay for your social care.
That's right, you got it right.
Obviously it's a problem that we're all having. So
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, and I mean, one of the troubling things that the Conservatives have said they will take £12 billion out of the welfare budget in the next 2 years, and there was a leaked report recently suggesting one way they might do that might be to tax disability benefits, which I think would be a very, very retrograde step if they did. But I think there's two things that are going on. One is local authority funding has been very substantially reduced, and so local councils are passing back onto their customers or their users, and that's why costs are going up in the way that you described. I think in the end, the answer is to bring together the health service, which is free, with the care service, which isn't. And I think if we were to run the two things properly together, then we could overcome some of these difficulties, and some of the care could then be provided as alongside the health service, which we don't pay for at all. And we could avoid the sort of inefficiencies which arise at the moment because the two services barely talk to each other and are managed completely separately. So I don't think that will solve the problem overnight, but I think we need to be very clear that is the direction that we should be going in, bringing together the health service and care service to work properly together in a way they certainly don't at the moment.
Thank you.
So, the Green Party is very committed to supporting people who need social care, and we have a commitment to provide free social care for the over 65s. On top of that, we would not close the Independent Living Fund, and we would help support disabled people keep all of their benefits that they're entitled to. So if the Green Party got into government, you would be better off than under any other party. We believe that it's, if someone is earning a lot of money, then they should pay from all of that wealth and income to support people who have had disadvantages in life, those at the bottom of the pile. Whereas at the moment what we're seeing is people at the bottom of the pile are expected to pay for everything. So I want to see some justice here in our system where the poorest are paying for the mistakes of the richest who are growing ever more wealthy. So I'm very proud that the Green Party is committed to providing free health and social care. And I would actually agree with Stephen here, who made a very good point, that at the moment social care is provided by local councils and healthcare is provided by the NHS. This doesn't make any sense. What we need to do is bring the two together, and then we can make sensible decisions about what budget to allocate where. And if we bring the two together, we cannot charge for those services. I think that is wrong, and I'm committed to fighting for free social care for everyone who needs it.
Can I just, sorry, before you go ahead, because I think we're missing one of the most important points, which is the funding for all of this. I mean, we've got some fantastic ideas. Stephen mentioned £2.5 billion from mansion tax, when Sir Stephen's report clearly said the NHS needed about £8 billion. So I'd like to know where this difference in the funding is going to come from. And to yourself, I really admire your passion for, social justice, but at the end of the day, there's a cost attached to that social justice. So I would like to know, for practical reasons, because this is what Samir's been saying, for practical reasons we can't carry out or create a utopia society. We have to live within our means. So I'd like to know what your thoughts were on practical funding.
But would you mind if I answer this question? I'm very glad you've raised that point, because there's some disinformation being given out here, and I want to rely on the facts. Okay. Now, Labour left us not with a £3 trillion debt, but correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen. What was left was an original debt of £800 billion. Okay, and what happened was George Osborne said that he would be able to start working away at the deficit, but he couldn't. And we now have a debt of £1.8 trillion. Okay, that is the actual figure. All right. Now, what we need to do is we need to grow the economy, and that helps us if we create more jobs, we bring in more tax, and if you look at what's happened in this country before, okay, at the moment we have a debt that is 80% of our GDP. Okay. Now, if we go back to just after the Second World War, just as we were about to create the NHS, we had a debt that was substantially bigger. It was 250% of GDP. And what did we do? We invested in our wonderful NHS. We created the welfare state. 20 years later, our debt was 30% of GDP. And what we've seen here in the last 5 years is the coalition's inability to understand basic economics and to manage the economy in a way that contributes to our growth as a nation and the support of the most vulnerable. So we're still behind where we were in the economy in 2008. We haven't even caught up yet to where we should be. And the Green Party, with our Professor of Economics, who's an elected MEP, Molly Scott-Cato, predicted that that's exactly what would happen. So we have a very sensible plan to tackle the deficit, to tackle the debt, but also to grow our economy, because it's the government and small businesses that create jobs. As a small business owner myself, okay, I know how to create jobs, and it comes from small business and government funding, and that's what the Green Party are committed to do.
Stephen, if you give me a moment, could I let Paul and Samir actually answer the lady's question as she asked it first, and then follow on with your answer. So I'll give you both 6 minutes so that you can answer both questions together.
Thanks, Joyce, for that excellent thing that you've raised. I mean, it's completely dark. I mean, no common sense person would agree that it's a good thing to pay people one amount of money, increase a certain disability payment, and then take it away with the other hand. I mean, it's, all that does is provide lots of jobs for more pen pushers in the government, dealing with the welfare system, unproductive spending. It really is daft. I think everyone would probably agree with that. In terms of the social care and NHS budgets, the minister responsible for this, Norman Lamb, is a Lib Dem minister, and he's taken the first steps towards this. He set out how it can be done, but it does require a certain amount of decentralisation of decision-making authority. In the NHS. The NHS decision-making is very, very centralised. And even if you look at what appear to be local decisions, they're always made under the auspices of the NHS nationally, micromanaging every decision. So it's really very difficult. It's very difficult to implement integrated social care and health budgets of the type necessary to deal with the problem, Joyce, that we were talking about. It's very difficult to implement that if the NHS is managed in a sort of monolithic, sort of quasi-Soviet national structure. It has to be decentralised, and budgets have to be decentralised, and people have to be able to make decisions locally. And only then is it really kind of practical, from a day-to-day point of view, to provide the sort of individual budgeting and care decisions which are required. I mean, my mother was very poorly and had home care visits three times a week. It was kind of haphazard, it's very difficult, they kept running out of money and all this sort of thing. It was a bit chaotic, to be honest with you. So I think those are reforms which are kind of work in progress, and whichever government comes into power on May the 7th, they are going to have to probably concede that the NHS and social care budgets will have to be decentralised. Well, I'll say I am actually, and we as a party, very strongly against this idea of taxing benefits. For the very same reason. I mean, giving with one hand, taking away from the other. All that does, it provides lots of unproductive jobs in Whitehall and not much more. So I definitely support what Steve said about that. Thank you.
I'm going to try and twangle two points together, a couple of issues, because obviously it's very interesting that Stephen talks about exactly the point that I was going to make, and what the Conservative Party have been making about joining up both health and social care. And it's interesting that after Jeremy Hunt in his conference speech in 2014 talked about this, the Labour Party had now dawned upon the idea, but didn't think about this in 13 years in government. And in fact, the reason why, you're absolutely right, the reason why we lose so much money and money is getting lost through the system is because what was happening is there was so much red tape and so much bureaucracy, all the social care people were tangled with and completely separate from the healthcare. So literally, they were like operating completely two different systems, and which is why, again, in our 8 billion, or what we've said in the NHS, we want to join up health and social care. So then when you are getting your benefits for disability, as the NHS is free, at point of use, it will also be free for your social care. And that's the plan, that's the costed and funded plan that we're talking about. But just trying to cover up on a couple of other points that came back, and I know the Green Party said they want to create more jobs, but again you've got to question the judgment on this. You want to out-tax any wealth creator in this country, anyone that's making any money, any businesses that are making money, yet you want jobs to magically appear. The NHS is not going to, on its own, create enough jobs to sustain this economy. That's the reality. Now, we're all against aggressive tax avoidance, and just for the record, there have been more prosecutions under this government since 2010 than there were under the last government. So I'm not trying to say, we get big companies that are trying to, take their money out of the country, but we cannot get away from the fact that companies that earn money create jobs, and that's just another side issue, which was slightly, moving off the issue. And I know you talked about the professor of economics, and you said that you've got, one of your MEPs who predicted, what was going on, which was going on. But I'm sure, looking at the levels of borrowing and the way that the Labour government had absolutely no contingency plan to get out of the mess that we were left in, I don't think you needed a doctorate to work that out. But the reality is, and let's talk about the NHS. And just one final point, since we're on the NHS. I mean, the reality is, on the 8th of May, the Prime Minister is either going to be, it may take a bit longer, I know it took about a week last time, but the reality is the Prime Minister is either going to be David Cameron, or it's going to be Ed Miliband, propped up with Nicola Sturgeon on his right shoulder. Now, if that happens, and you want to see what's going on with the NHS, let's just take a look, for comparison's sake, and I did this the other day with Stephen, at the difference in the NHS where the Labour Party are running it and where the Conservatives are running it. And let's look at Wales and let's look at England. So let's look at patient satisfaction, which is, Stephen, I'm sure these are published figures. So where Labour are in control of the NHS in Wales, patient satisfaction is 51%. In England, where we're in control, 65%. Let's talk about A&E waiting times of patients that are seen within 4 hours. In Wales, 81%. In England, again, higher, 90%. Urgent ambulances are waiting, arriving within 8 minutes. 51% in Wales under Labour. In England, 72% under Conservatives. Now, we want this to be 100% and we want every target met. But the reality is that you need the economy, you need the funds, and you need the money there to back this up, and some strong leadership. Now, we're doing our best, and we hope that if we can put this 8 billion in, we'll make it a lot better.
Can I just make just one very quick? I mean, anyone who knows anything about the health service knows it's got far, far worse over the last 5 years under the stewardship of the current government. And one of the worst things they've done, there have been lots of awful things, one of the worst things they did, before the election they said they wouldn't do a top-down reorganisation. And as soon as they were elected, they introduced a top-down reorganisation that cost £3 billion, and things have got a jolly sight worse. It's made a terrible hash of things.
Stephen, there are also 1,000 more doctors, 4,000 more nurses since we came into power.
Everything's got worse than it.
Stephen,
Gentlemen. The lady on the back row in pink, please.
My name's Susan Allen, and I wondered if you win the next general election, will you be employing more nurses and doctors in our hospitals? Because I read yesterday that the nurses can't cope. They can't even feed the patients that can't feed themselves.
Unfortunately, that was the very first question that was asked, but it gives you an idea of the state of the NHS that it's being reiterated again. Everybody's got plans to try and increase funding, but we're all a little baffled about how they're going to do it at the moment. Angus.
You've all touched a bit on integrated care and putting the various bits of the health service the Tories tore apart back together. The Better Care Fund is called, Better Care Fund. Are you going to make any commitments to find new money to put into the Better Care Fund? Because at the moment, It's just redeploying existing money. And if you're serious about integrating care, some of that money needs to go into the Better Care Fund, I'd have thought.
I would like to add to that. We've all been talking about integrating care, and we've talked about the NHS, and we've talked about at-home social care. Nobody's mentioned social care for people in employment. I'm currently working and I get NHS care from my GP on the hospital, etc. I get a support worker plus supplied by social services to get me dressed in the morning, take me shopping, etc. Then I have to go to a third government agency and get more money and go to a different care agency to get support to be able to actually do my job. Why are people who are in work or wanting to work that are disabled being treated differently to disabled people? Again, that comes back to the point that Angus was making about where does the money come from, where does it go?
Shall I have a go on that one? I mean, I think the answer here is the things that Liz Kendall has been talking about with Andy Burnham. And Andy Burnham was talking about integrated social health and care long before Jeremy Hunt stood up at his conference speech. I think one approach here, which can be a very good one, is to give a personal budget to disabled people, whether they're in work or not, and then they choose how to deploy that funding for the various kinds of support that is available. And if you can do it then from one source rather than the three that you described, then that seems to me you're saving quite a lot of administrative costs in doing that and enabling the money to go further in providing care than it is at the moment. I mean, I'm not sure about the Better Care Fund. That's something that I'm not sure how that works. But I would hope very much that by improving resources in the way that I've described for the NHS, then we can ease some of the pressure elsewhere in the system and free up more resources for proper care.
So, if I'm to answer your question correctly, I think what we need to do is really spend some time listening to disabled people about what they actually need rather than what politicians think they need, and make sure that the money is available to do that, and it's from a unified government service and not parcelled out to different private companies. I've seen what happens in hospitals where one company looks after the providing the food and the dispensing of pills, and a different company looks after dressing and washing, and then another company looks after another thing. I don't think that is a patient-centred approach. You need a person who understands that your individual needs. So, maybe you need your pills before dinner or after dinner. And if you've got all these different companies running these different aspects, that can't happen. And I think you can only provide that if you have a unified government service in the public hands managing this stuff. And I understand the need for efficiency in the service and the idea that markets can provide that efficiency. But what we've seen in practice is with healthcare, it doesn't work, and it's affecting people's health and their satisfaction with the service. I've seen it in my own family with my mother-in-law, who is she's not being treated as she needs to by these different companies, and I worry about her, and I don't want anyone else to have to struggle against that. And the Green Party believes in market systems in some areas of the economy, but in health, it's far too precious to leave to the markets. So I want there to be free, joined up social care everywhere, and I'm happy to be grilled about where we find the money for that, because it really is there.
That was the actual question.
Okay,
Are you going to
okay.
be robbing Peter's paid Paul? Because
Okay.
none of the funding for disability benefits are ring-fenced.
Okay. So I think that if disabled people get the benefits that they need in order to survive, that are realistic and matched to what they actually have to pay for, then we should trust them to decide how to use those benefits. And if the right things are made available for free, then the choice is a lot easier. And what we would like to do is to actually, we've got a number of ways that we can both save money in the NHS and bring in new money, as well as local councils. So, and we could start by looking at the £120 billion that's lost through tax loopholes every year in this country. And the HMRC has its budget slashed for looking at these loopholes. And as a result, people in small businesses like me get examined very carefully, but large corporations like HSBC, for example, are left to dodge as much tax as they like. And we need to address this. So the Green Party is being sensible about the amount of money we can get, like £30 billion back from tax loopholes.
Yeah, I think the question of ring-fence spending is a kind of macro issue here, which is that if you ring-fence NHS spending to an extent, then you say you're going to slash the welfare budget, then everyone's going to try and do their best to hurry into an NHS budget and sort of escape from the welfare cuts. But it really makes it very clear that you can't really improve social care services to people in dire need if you don't deal with the institutional problems. And for example, the kind of personalised budget, the individual budgets idea. I think that's a great idea. It was a little bit of a gimmick. I mean, when my mother was very ill, there was a personalised budget, and they wrote very nice letters to her about your personalised budget enables you to do business, but it didn't really make any difference. It's quite difficult for an elderly person to make sophisticated budgetary decisions based on a 4-page letter that they received. I mean, she just gives it to me and says, what do you make of all this stuff, kind of thing. So that seemed to me to be rather gimmicky. But really, from a practical point of view, you can kind of make a kind of politician's sweeping promise, but unless you deal with the institutional problems and get decisions made close to the customers, so to speak, it's going to carry on with lots of overarching, wonderful sounding promises, but it's the individual citizens in need is where you judge the effectiveness of the system, not the beauty of the speech, if you see what I mean. One just quick thing to say is that we have a fully funded, our party has a fully funded programme of 8 billion extra investment. But I have to say part of that money is to support the mental health reforms which we've been outlining in the last 3 months and will continue to push for, which is the equal treatment of mental health services compared to physical health services. It is a bit of a problem, especially if people have a combination of difficulties. They have physical disability, some cognitive problems or whatever it is, or even alcohol and drug-related issues. So, and also there's a big difficulty, again with this budget problem. If you're getting support when you're 17 years of age, when you get to 18, it sort of drops off the edge, and then well, who's my contact now? Parents suffer from this problem as well. So really insistent provided the funding to have equal treatment of the mental and physical problems throughout the NHS, and to roll out a much more focused and patient-orientated approach with proper standards for mental health care. The extent to which the Better Care Fund is in practice, it's a temporary budget, it's not consolidated into a long-term plan, and so it needs to be put on a better statutory footing and needs to have a visible budget line which Parliament can vote for. At the moment it's not.
Yeah, I mean, again, I know Stephen said that Andy Burnham and Labour Party were talking about this for a long time. It begs the question again, after 13 years in government, why was nothing done about it? You know, if we talk about a better care fund, you know, the 5.3 billion which came about in June 2013 was actually under this government.
It's not new money though.
Well, the money that was allotted and what purpose of it for was much more streamlined. The initiative and the direction was much clearer. The impact was so that both, you know, the NHS and the local government, because don't forget a lot of the costings, the costs that are paid are not always, you know, national government. A lot of it was local authority, local government. The idea was to kind of join them up together, and what we're hoping, again, and I keep kind of trying to reiterate that, is that with our pledge of putting that money back into the NHS, we pledge to keep what's already in place, to try and make that, you know, sharpen that up and make it more efficient. So, you know, we're not kind of having these problems. But, you know, again, and also, you know, I often hear this idea, you know, the nasty Tories are privatising the NHS. But let me just ask you this. A couple of years ago, it was taking a bit longer than it should have done in the NHS to supply wheelchairs for disabled children. So the option was, you either let those kids stay in hospital or have to arrange for their parents to get, you know, make certain arrangements around that, or you bring in another company, in which case it was WizKids. WizKids were brought in to...
Sorry, I want to finish. I was just wondering...
So WizKids were brought in and they sped up the thing, and, you know, they got the wheelchairs out for the young kids, and they were off and on their way. Again, let's look at Specsavers, the nasty Tories. You know, we're privatising everything. The people that needed glasses that couldn't get them in time, you know, what we did is we called in a company to make sure that demands were met. Those people got their glasses and went on. So I know you often hear, you know, the scaremongering, you know, that we are, you know, we're not the party of the NHS, and we're not, you know, we're going to privatise it and do this. The party of the NHS is the one that has ring-fenced £12.9 billion. The party of the NHS is the one that increases the number of doctors and nurses. And the party of the NHS, to me, is one that pledges enough money, according to an independent report, to make it work. Not, you know, mislead people on £2.5 billion of a mansion tax, which leaves a massive £5.5 billion black hole. And people overlook that. And for me, that's what the reality is of the NHS. Sorry.
Yes, you're right.
At the moment, ladies and gentlemen, we are still on our first topic, and we are running approximately 40 minutes late. So we can stay with health and social care and leave out everything else, or we can choose one other topic to move on to so that we can finish the time. Transport. Okay. So, Farrell, would you like to move forward so that we can...
Sure.
Hopefully we will have some time left at the end still for the free-for-all, so that any other questions that people may have
Did I miss your
will be
question?
available.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Are you sure?
Don't interrupt as well, but
Oh,
we were supposed to finish
I
the
don't want to
section
be rude, just say-
240 and it's 3:15 now. So.
This is a motive subject.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brianna from Transport Fraud. I would just like to briefly introduce and ask the candidates about access to transport. So, Transport Fraud is a disability rights organisation involved with disabled people, and we champion access and travel in London, and work obviously with local people here in Newham as well. For us, we're really passionate about the fact that transport is really the thread that connects people to all areas of their life, to work, to home, to family, friends, local high street. It's pretty scandalous that even in 2015, living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, that we party or parties, what are you going to do about improving accessible transport? And what I'd like to say is that when I asked this question to candidates at our last hustings event, everyone went back to talking about Transport for London controlled services. And obviously we are in London, and Transport for London and also local authorities control. But but I'm going to ask you, if you were the parliamentary candidate, what you're going to do in your remit in terms of national government to look at funding and policies around accessible transport, please, and also to just put your attention to the 7 demands that we have, which are around rail station accessibility, bus accessibility, ending some discrimination on taxi and private hire vehicles, but also number 7, which is taking a trip with a disabled, an older disabled constituent to see yourself the first-hand reality of travelling, as a disabled older person. So yeah, so the question is, what would you do in Parliament if you were the local MP, elected, re-elected, around government, changing government policy? And please do don't talk about Transport for London related transport or indeed local authority, but what the government can do. Thank you very much.
Shall we go in the opposite direction for a while and start with Samir next time?
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so firstly on point 7, you speak to me straight after, and I'd love to come along with you. I'm sure probably everyone else will, because as you said, unless you actually get first-hand experience, you don't realise how difficult it is. I think what we need to do is, and what we need to make sure we keep doing is sticking with the Access for All funding programme. We've committed another £100 million up until 2019 to make. What we've already done is looked at the 150 most inaccessible stations, which aren't just in London. You need to look outside of London as well, and trying to make them a lot more accessible for disabled people. In 2010, we made sure the taxi vehicles and similar vehicles within London, private hire vehicles, also had to start beginning to adhere to having some accessibility for people with disabilities. But there's a long way to go yet. I mean, as I said before, we're looking at 2020 as a target, realistic target, let's say, for all rail vehicles to have an accessibility point for people with disabilities to come and do that. If we look at the buses, and we look at in 2015, we made sure that many of the single buses had to now adhere to the accessibility rules for people with disabilities. And again, we've now pledged that we've got a new target for 2016, another certain number for 2018 and for 2020 to include double-decker buses as well. And you're right, a lot more needs to be done. And I think it's a shame really, because with the best will in the world, I don't think any government, and let's be honest, whether you're Labour, Tory, Green or whoever it may be, no one wants to legislate against, and no one wants the worst for those that are not as better off, in terms of physically better off in society. But I think within the last Parliament, I think the government, what they tried to do was get back on their feet and make sure there was the funding, and the economy was stable enough for us to allow funding for these various schemes. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how much further we can get if we do get back in government. We're pushing things forward, but we're already excited with the 100 million that we've pledged up until 2019.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question raised in a good way. Just to go through very quickly some of the national policies. First of all, private hire. It's our policy to make accessibility a licence condition as a national policy for private hire vehicles. Secondly, we think it's rather regrettable the High Court, the Appeal Court decision on the use of wheelchairs in buses. And I think there's been a lot of progress, more in London than the rest of the UK, so that we need to roll out the rest of the UK what's happened in London with the improved access in the vehicles and the kneeling vehicles and this sort of thing, which has been customary in lots of countries around the world long before it was in the UK. But there was a decision which was rather difficult, which is that the buses don't have an obligation to give priority to wheelchair users on buses if there's buggies and things like that. My feeling is that we need to legislate to deal with that problem. Unfortunately, we do do this legislative thing now. On the question of national rail, part of the difficulty in disabled access and full access in national rail stations is that the franchisees sort of manage the stations and collect the revenue and so on. But the stations, the physical ownership of the stations is the state company rail track. So in the end, what we have to do is to ensure that the franchise conditions include upgrading. At the moment, it's done in a rather cumbersome way, with the central government providing funding for individual stations. It should be increased, nevertheless, it is a rather cumbersome way of doing it. So I think it's much better to have the franchisees, whether state or private, to have an obligation to upgrade and to include in the bids. And in some cases, you can actually revise there are conditions in all of these franchisee arrangements where you can make additions to obligations, but the government is often in a weak position to try and get good value for the money being spent. But it's a complex issue. It's not one of those things where you can just sort of make a sweeping spending commitment, although we have, but it's not enough. I've already said something about the TFL. I mean, it is rather lamentable that after the overground was upgraded, essentially for the Olympics, only half of the stations have secondary access. I mean, it's pretty appalling if you think about the money that was spent. And I've already said something about the tube system. We'll probably come back to that in a moment. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Well, the Green Party is committed to renationalising national transport, particularly the railways, and we've already brought in a private members bill that will actually take the railway franchises back into public hands one by one as they become available. So we know that this is possible to do, and I would rather trust disabled access to a joined up rail track and which is in national hands, as Samir rightly pointed out, with publicly owned rail transport and coach franchises. So if we have that joined up thinking, we won't have any of this, we don't have to provide accessible stations because we don't own the station. We'd be able to actually talk to each other and cooperate on disabled access. And I think that's so important. When we fragment the service, disabled people suffer. So, and we've already seen how the East Coast Rail Service managed far better and delivered back £1 billion to the national coffers than the failing franchise that we took over from. So we see how public transport, national infrastructure, is better for everybody when it's owned and run by the government. And I want to say that I spent a year in a wheelchair myself, and transport was horrendous. And I have no idea what it's like to manage day to day. I just had a year, but I really sympathise with the transport conditions that are faced by disabled people, and I love the talking buses. And I think we need to roll that out nationally so that anyone, no matter where they're travelling, is able to understand where they are and how to access what they need. So, and we have, in the manifesto, we have all the costings to do this, so I'd encourage you to read it. I don't want to bore anyone anymore with financial things, but it is in there, it is possible. Stephen?
I think accessible all stations point is a very, very important one. Interesting, the reason that the Jubilee line, the newer bit of the Jubilee line, is accessible is because Newham Council, when I was leader of it, had an objection into the bill in Parliament, which the council rightly absolutely refused to remove until commitment was given to make the new Jubilee line accessible. And I think that was a service that Newham Council provided to London as a whole, a very valuable one. I think it's disappointing, the figure that Samir's given us for access funding for the next period up to 2019 is, I think, it's about a 40% reduction on the amount of money that's been provided in the current period. So I'm worried we're going backwards on that. I really think we ought to be doing more. On the disability equality training for bus drivers, I think we seem to be doing better in London on that than in other parts of the country. But the European Union has introduced a directive to make disability equality training mandatory for bus drivers. Unfortunately, the British government negotiated an opt-out from that requirement, and that was the Lib Dems Minister, Norman Baker.
If I could just add, there is also a directive that says that wheelchairs should be made a priority on buses in that same legislation.
Yeah.
But it was also opted out of.
Not priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be really clear about that the spaces that are provided in buses are primarily for wheelchairs. That is the reason the spaces are there. Now, of course, it's nice for people with buggies, no doubt, to use them, but they're actually, the space is there for wheelchair users, and I think that's an important aspect of that equality training that bus drivers need to recognise. That's what it's there for. That is the priority, because otherwise people in wheelchairs are not able to move around at all.
The High Court decision was against it, there was an appeal.
Yes.
And it was concluded that the TFA don't have the right to give priority to wheelchairs, so we do need to.
Well, there's a further appeal. It's going to the Supreme Court. But my point is, the reason those spaces are there in buses is for wheelchairs.
That was the original reason.
That was the reason for putting them there. So I think you need to be clear that that's what they're for, and make sure they're used for that purpose. And if it does require a change in the law arising from the appeal, then we'll have to make that. I think that we do need to look at what is happening at rail stations with staffing, and I think the way to do that is in the franchise negotiations and the contracts that you renewed from time to time. There should be much more emphasis on security and accessibility at the stations, and also at the availability of British Transport Police at stations as well. That's, I think, a rather neglected element of those franchise negotiations at the moment. And one of the 7 points in the Transport for All list was that people, wheelchair users, should not be charged extra for a wheelchair. Now, I would be appalled if anyone was charged extra. I wonder whether that's something that's maybe different outside London. But certainly, if there's anyone locally, if there was anyone locally who was having to pay extra for carrying a wheelchair in a taxi, then I'd very much like to know about that.
Yeah, it's not a compulsory licence condition. That's the problem.
Yeah. I would also be delighted to take the trip with a disabled person.
Could I just also, you quoted the 100 million. If you look at the Department for Transport's press release on the 29th of April 2014, it was a further 100 million. So it wasn't actually a reduction.
Yeah. Well, no, the amount per year is less. It was 43 million a year in the period that we're coming to the end of, and it's a smaller amount per year in the period up to 2019. So it's a cut.
No, we're sustaining the original one.
Gentlemen, can we argue the semantics later, please?
Firstly, about wheelchair spaces on buses, a lot of the problem would go away if we legislated that mothers had to carry their babies in buggies and not small tanks. So my main point is just, it's all very well go to meetings with TFA, they're on about how their buses are accessible, bus stops are accessible, they made more stations accessible. Trouble is, once you get off the bus and go down the street, which is in control of the local authority, you can't get to your destination. It's all very well having accessible buses if you can't have access to the bus stop. So Robert's my question would be, how can we join that up between my front door and the bus stop?
Yeah.
How can we make local authority?
Are you talking about street furniture, or are you talking about the maintenance of the streets themselves.
Maintenance and street furniture.
Okay, so street furniture for people who don't understand are things like the A-frame boards that shops put out, and the bins and things like that are generally there that you have to weave around. And the second point is the maintenance of the pavements, so broken paving slabs. The fact that, say, BT come out and rip up the pavement one day to do some work, then it gets filled in, and a couple of days later turns water around it, etc. So,
Completely. I mean, a lot of the stuff, like Steve and I've also been, I was a councillor, he was legal council, so you find a lot of the stuff in terms of, local issues, the pavements, etc., will be down to local government. But definitely, I think a lot more needs. I certainly will be going back to more senior people in my party to talk about things that I've learned from today, and especially after I come out with you guys. Because again, I don't think any party here, tries to legislate against or not in the favour of. I think it's the issue is awareness and understanding. But listening to some of the stories, you're absolutely right. What's the point of spending the money on the buses if you can't get to the bus stop? So it's I take that point away completely, and I'll definitely look into that and get you something back in writing. But it's been a great eye opener for me because
contrary to popular perception, British local government and delegated authorities are riddled with conflicts of interest and corruption in my personal experience. And conflicts of interest in particular, and a lot of contracts which are let for things like small repairs and road repairs and this sort of thing. Quite often, it's extraordinary secrecy in the United Kingdom against these contracts, and wildly irresponsible overuse of the concept of commercial confidentiality, which is our policy to get a big, sharp knife and cut through this commercial confidentiality nonsense. Quite often, if the general public were able to see the particular contract which had been let to undertake a particular repair, which they can't at the moment because of these ludicrous secrecy rules, then it would go to great lengths to solve the problem. Because if you've got some roadworks going on outside you, or some pavement repair which has been requested and paid for in the budget, and then you see that the contract was to start something and finish something, and you know how much the contract is worth, then the local population, as they do, for example, in Switzerland, Japan, Singapore, other places, where you can find out what the contracts cost, public pressure is often enough to get the problem sorted out. Otherwise, in order to solve the problem, you're talking of kind of sweeping generalities that never come to anything. But the public pressure is the way to deal with the problem.
Thank you very much. So thanks for your question. I think it's well put and nicely humorous. It's difficult if you're in a wheelchair to get around on the streets, and it's especially difficult when people decide to park on the pavement. And the Green Party is committed to ending pavement parking and situations where we have ultimate priority of cars over mobility for people with access requirements and people who are just trying to walk. So we have a transport priority, and we put walking and mobility devices for disabled people right at the top of that. And then second comes cycling, and after that we have public transport like buses and trains. So we would ensure that local authorities are funded properly to make sure that their streets are properly maintained. And we've got a situation here where local authorities are so poorly funded that they are having to make really dreadful decisions, like whether to...
It's not a funding problem, it's not a funding problem. It really isn't.
Sorry? It is a funding problem.
So, and we would also, like the Lib Dems, end commercial confidentiality for government contracts. That's a manifesto pledge. So we want to end the tyranny of cars and give equal access, put people in wheelchairs and with other mobility aids on an equal footing to drivers. And we would also bring in a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in urban areas, which in Brighton has saved 200 lives.
I think it is a funding problem. I think there is, at the moment, there isn't.
Well, if you're Labour, everything is always a funding problem.
Certainly in this area, undoubtedly there is. Because what's happened is that the cuts in capital investment that's been made has hit road repairs, pavement repairs, and the kind of things that make it difficult to get around. There's lots of potholes in the roads, and the resources for repairing them properly aren't in place. So I think we do need to recognise the importance of investing in the fabric of pavements and streets as part of a programme to maintain and develop the infrastructure around the country. And it's not sufficiently important at the moment. I'm glad that thanks to Labour pressure, the government has agreed to establish a strategy for cycling and walking as part of its infrastructure investment, and I would hope that will give the opportunity to raise and highlight the importance of these issues in the next few years.
Can I just ask, because there seems to be a disparity between it is a funding problem, it isn't a funding problem. I think for my sake, I would like some hard figures of what you think. Take Newham, for example. I mean, Stephen, you were in the Treasury for a better part of a decade in the last government.
I was in and out of the Treasury.
In and out of the Treasury for the best part of a decade. I mean, how much are we talking about in hard cash figures?
I haven't got the figures for spending nationally or in Newham, but it is certainly one of the areas that has suffered, and I think we need to recognise it's actually very important for exactly the reason we're being reminded today.
Yes. Look, I want to say something to the people, all of the people in this room and the organisations which have organised this meeting. If you really think all the problems can be solved by throwing more money at it, let's just think about this disability access thing in the London Underground. These PFI systems, which were introduced foolishly by Gordon Brown, these PFI, although I happen to know some of the people that invented this PFI idea, and I was against it right from the start, but these PFI deals in London Underground, they have wasted $900 million. $900 million. And I'm an economist, I tell you, I've looked at the detail, and I'm one of the few people that's read from cover to cover, well, not every word, but it's 1.2 million pages. The Metronet contract is 1.2 million pages. There were 14 pages describing the size of a cigarette butt. The lawyers had a field day. These PFI contracts are a menace, and they're a menace in the NHS as well. And I'm broadly in favour of private sector contracting where everything can be managed properly, but often the authorities do not have the competence or the integrity to be able to manage these contracts. I mean, just look at this thing recently. £300 million was completely wasted only 18 months ago in a contract to upgrade signalling in London. And because they had not specified the contracts properly, and because they had made the contract so favourable to the contractors, that they ended up, the French and German contractors, they ended up having to pay £300 million for nothing. It's not always a funding problem. Really, when you look at the thing in detail, it really isn't. I've really put my heart on that.
I'd like to point out though, if we're talking about who's wasting the most money, this is a problem that has happened under both governments.
Yes, true.
So none of the parties here, with exception to the Greens who haven't been in government, can say that they're better than the others.
I'm saying it's not always a money problem. I'm just giving that example. I mean, £75 million has been allocated to improve wheelchair access, step-free access in London tube stations.
If we take that point,
75 million at the current rate of the crazy TFA. They spent £500,000 closing each ticket office.
If
It's
we take that
completely
75 million,
yes.
how many disabled charities have been asked to actually consult on what improvements are needed on those stations?
Yeah, well, it's a big leap. I mean, the other difficulty is
It's
that
not a big leap. If you are trying to make improvements
Yeah.
in disability access,
yeah.
why are you not asking disabled people what improvements are needed?
Well, me personally, but no. What I'm saying is that £75 million is almost zero. I mean, if they spend 39 million on trying to give step-free access to Shepherd's Bush Station, yeah, and they don't even end up with access after spending the money, 75 million, it's going to pay for two stations or three stations. It's not enough money. Sorry, yes. I haven't dodged the question. I'm being very specific.
Well, look, I'm going to be very honest. There are times where, you know, I can sit here and try and avoid it and dodge it, but the reality is, clearly, for me just sitting here today, there needs to be a hell of a lot more, not just a little bit, but a hell of a lot more consultation with people with disabilities. As I said, I'm looking forward to coming out with you guys and doing that. But just touching on the point, I mean, the Lib Dems say, you know, it's not an issue of finance. They've had the good fortune. I mean, let's be really realistic and practical. They've had the good fortune of riding on the coattails of the Conservative Party for the past 5 years. Stephen talks about not knowing the figures. Let me give you some figures about what we're doing with potholes. We've pledged between 2015 and 2021, 18 million potholes and further road improvements we have pledged, including pavements where they're not being dealt with. And I think that
it's getting worse.
Well, we've pledged 15. No, you wanted to know figures. We'll give you figures. £15 billion, which is 15 billion more than the Labour put into potholes and side road recovery. Let's talk about cyclists. I mean, we talk about Labour pressure again. This is the same as Andy Burnham, suggesting joined up healthcare, but after 13 years in government, they have an epiphany when in opposition. The same with cycling. You guys are supposed to have talked us into it, but we're the guys that put £200 million into it. That's the difference. And we need to be really practical. And I mean, this whole concept, and it's a shame UKIP aren't here, because they would turn around today and say to you, we're going to come out of the EU and save so many £1 billion, and we're going to invest that in, we're going to invest £5 billion into this, 6 billion. Well, they've overspent that 16 billion 8 times. And it comes down to financial prudence and being honest and being practical and admitting that the situation isn't great, and the situation, the £3 trillion worth of mess, and I won't use another word for it, that we inherited, that is the reality.
Is it just me that's fed up of the political ping pong game here?
Not only that, but I'm also fed up with the lie of the deficit of debt. It's just ridiculous. The money is there. We all know some of us know the money is there. It's just the way it's being allocated. The money is going to the rich. It's socialism for the rich, and it's basic capitalism for the poor. Now, you need to address that system. I can't.
Can we?
Sorry.
We are really late. It is 3:49 at the moment, so I'm going to let Rachel and Stephen finish up on this question, and then I'm going to take some more questions from the floor.
Sorry, what did you say? We started at that end, then we went there, then we went there,
Can I just give one quick end of this one? Sorry. It's really easy, and I know it sounds great and for the smaller parties to talk about this ping pong, but the bottom line is, it's about funding this thing and doing the right thing. And I know it's easy to give sound bites when you've got no chance of coming in, as the Lib Dems found, about the tuition fees. When you're actually in government, you realise what the pressures are. So.
Well, we have been in government. We have several MEPs. We have several.
You've got the worst recycling rates in the UK.
Recycling rate is here in Newham, which is a Labour chemical.
So, yes.
Yes, I want to go back several minutes ago. When all the candidates and I applaud you all for this. You all said, yes, we'll come out with a disabled person. And I do applaud you all for saying that, and I'm also very angry that not one of you thought to do that before a pressure group asked you to do it. So it makes me feel, as the last 5 or so years have made me feel, that I'm worthless unless I can find someone to fight my battle. Why don't you just listen to me? Why don't you go to any of the groups in Durham and say, can we come out and see what it's like with some of your regulars or some people you know? Why does it take something like this and a general election before somebody says, oh yeah, that's a really good idea, let's go out with somebody who's got needs that might need addressing? Why did not one of you think of doing that before? And I'm addressing that to all of you.
Shall I start? I've only been parliamentary candidate here since December, and I'm trying to...
I'm talking about government on a national level. Obviously, you are representing here, but no government has ever come to me. I mean, I'm going to do tricks now, this sidetrack. All these direct payments. They've just handed me money with my mental health problems and physical problems. Said, go sort out your own care. Don't keep passing it over. Come and talk to us and ask what we want. And so for the transport, why did you not go to any of the groups in Newham or anywhere else and say, can we come out with somebody before we go back to our government and make decisions about this?
So you're coming back to the point about the lack of consultation.
Yeah.
But I agree there needs to be more. As soon as I got the opportunity, I'm here and I agree.
You always had the opportunity.
Well, not really new, am I?
You had. Any area, you could go to any of the groups and say, can I come out with somebody?
Well, in which case, fair enough, I apologise for not having done. And to be honest, our time does get split with different departments of what work. We do a lot of stuff in defence. So, when you become a candidate, you're open to kind of everything. So, but I will be going back to my party and telling them some of the stuff that I'm looking forward to coming out with you guys and going in. I think, Stephen, through fairness, Stephen was in the Treasury, so I'm sure he maybe he had his other colleagues who were dealing with this a bit more. But I'm definitely looking forward to coming out.
And as I say, I appreciate you all saying that, but that's not my point. Is now you're asked, and now it's coming up to a general election. Now you're all eager to do it. What the attitude is that I'm getting as a voter is that unless we make a really big fuss, and some people aren't able to be vocal, aren't able to get out there, then nobody really cares about it. That's what the parties are giving me. Specifically your party, I've got to be honest.
I think you're absolutely right. You're putting a very challenging point to us. But actually, I'd kind of turn it round. I think the good thing about an election campaign is we all do talk to each other. Because none of the groups has asked me to come out previously, and I think it's a very good idea and it's a good question. Why hasn't that request been made? But we need to be talking more. I think maybe not just at election time.
I wouldn't even know procedures thing. As an individual, I wouldn't even know. I know how to get in touch with you because it's in the Newham Mag.
I think on the general issue that you raised, I think it's certainly true that the consultation processes are utterly lamentable. And it's just one of those awful cultural things, both when legislation is being developed and when individual politicians are trying to work out solutions to problems. And there's an over-reliance, especially with the advent of professional spin-based politicians. The kind of what people do, politicians, ministers tend to leave it to the civil servants to do the work. And the civil servants are not just poor at consulting, but they're just dead against it in the first place. It's quite extraordinary. And there's a lot of how lots of money gets wasted. I mean, if you're going to deal with, problems of access on buses, I mean, you need to ask the people exactly what is the best thing to do. The servants, they always know that. And it's a problem. And if you've got politicians with a bit more experience of things, being a head of the local authorities, is a good example. If you have a bit of experience of things, then it's a bit easier to force the civil servants to engage in a proper consultation process. And also, it does not that if you're an elected politician, it doesn't take much to pick up the phone and ask people, before I have a go at the civil servants about disabled access, let's have a little chat and you can equip me a bit better before I go into battle with them. It doesn't really take much to do that.
That's my point. You can't fix the problems if you're not asking the people.
Absolutely. If we can let Rachel answer, and then there's a lady on the middle row who's been waiting patiently for ages to ask a question, so we'll move on to her.
I want to say that I really hear you it must feel so unjust that you are trying to make your voice heard, and not only that, but you're trying to make the voices of other people heard who just can't speak for themselves. And yet, you know, just before an election, everyone comes out and goes, oh yeah, we'll help disabled people. And it must, I can feel your anger, and rightly so. And I want to say that I'm just a normal person. I'm not a career politician, but I've had enough experience of life to know what it's like when you're disabled. Particularly with me, I ran a small business. At the time, I became suddenly disabled, and I had to watch my business crumble away before my eyes because I filled in a disability benefits form and was given no support. And I had to buy my own wheelchair, and I was lying on my sofa, barely able to move, and my employees were good enough to help me keep things afloat. But that was not easy, and so I know what it's like. And most of the Green Party know what it's like because most of us are not career politicians. And I'm here, I'm doing this because I want to speak up for people who don't have the expensive spin doctors, and they need to be able to talk to people, and I'm here to make that happen.
Thank you. The lady next to the honour.
Hi, my name is Simone Asvis from the Alliance for Inclusive Education, which is an organisation that campaigns for inclusive education practice. So I just wanted to ask you, really, all of you, the same question, and that is what will you all do to promote inclusive education practice, in particularly around ensuring that disabled and non-disabled people have an absolute right to access mainstream education because they don't at the moment under the Children and Families Act. In terms of entitlement to support, when they're in the classroom, the lessons, they don't have an entitlement to that. An entitlement fully for lessons to be taking place in fully accessible buildings, and for the curriculum to be accessible for everybody, including implementation of the curriculum, and in terms of qualifications being made fully accessible and inclusive of disabled learners. And last but not least, in terms of promoting becoming qualified teachers who have disability equality training. So, wanting to ask in relation to those subjects, those issues, what each one of you will do. Which bits would you take off the Children and Families Bill Act? Which bits you think, crikey, I really wish we didn't do that. That would be helpful. And the last question is around Disabled Students Allowance. If you elected, because now the Disabled Students Allowance is now on hold, whoever gets in government will have to deal with the issue because it's still subject to consultation. So if you could be elected, what would you do around Disabled Students Allowance?
Because this is an area that we had to bypass, it's 4 o'clock now, so I'm going to give everybody 5 minutes each to answer the question, and then we're going to have to draw the meeting to a close because we will be at 4:20. So this is probably your most important question because it's your last chance to speak. What will you do to make disabled education mainstream and give equal opportunities to students regardless of their abilities?
Start again? Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I mean, I think the issues surrounding this, and whichever government it may be, is the difference in needs that are in the classes and the classrooms, and whether that be accessibility or people with varying different disabilities are not always going to be on the same platform as other students that have it. Some may have visual disabilities, some may have physical, some may have various others. So it's just really complex, and it's a really serious issue. Now, I don't think this is something that's going to just be solved overnight. Walking away from here today, I will seriously be putting in some advice into our team to be consulting groups like yourself, because it's not something that you can kind of sit in Whitehall and sit behind a desk and legislate for. I really don't think that. The complexities of disabilities that are out there, it's tough enough kind of putting 30 kids in a classroom and trying to get them all on one level platform when you're teaching to them, let alone you know, if we're trying to throw in everybody, and there should be, let me make one other point very clear, there has to be an equal opportunity for, you know, for disabled children in schools. How we go about that really depends on the consultation process going forward, and quite frankly, I think unless we've got people like yourselves on the ground who are coming forward and actually giving your own life experiences and your own children's experiences, we're not going to get this right. If you ask me what my opinion is, this is my opinion, and this is something I'm going to go back to my party and say that there needs to be on the ground consultation, and not, and I think one thing, you know, that was said, which is actually absolutely correct, a lot of the time civil servants don't want to go out and consult. You know, they employ these companies who are sat behind their computers in another office and give off wild information which isn't accurate. So something I'm going to go back ahead with. And you talked about the disabled students allowance. And again, you know, I think before we just go ahead and say yes or no with that, I think we need to look at what services are being provided around that as well. Because if there's, you know, for example's sake, if it's for, you know, getting into school, but we manage to find a way to, you know, to kind of integrate them so they don't need that extra bit of money, then of course, you know, that would be viable.
Education, sorry. The TFA supports students getting universities.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know that.
It's your government fund.
Well, I'm going to look into that again, and that's something else I'll come back to. There's 2 or 3 things I'm going to come back to you on, and that's my commitment to before I pass on, is A, this is, you can make note of this, and so I'm speaking to people in my parties, A is about the accessibility around not just the, you know, transport infrastructure, like buses, etc. It's around the services leading up to either stops. That's something that I will get a clear answer with. Secondly, is absolutely about this. It's about who we're going to consult, right? And if we haven't consulted people on the ground, why are we not doing that? And why I'm definitely going to be recommending we do a lot more to do that. Absolutely, this has been an eye-opener. Thanks. This is my last word. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to coming out with whichever one it may be on. One of you guys, it might be on the date that you set, but not somewhat too scary, please.
Yeah, I think one of the things which I find rather upsetting is when you see kids in the street, you know, mocking and making fun of people who have disability. And I've seen it myself in West London and this part of London as well. And it says to me that not enough is being done to make sure that people with disabilities, physical and otherwise, are integrated into the education system. And there does need to be a stronger statutory responsibility. And if we are in coalition after May the 7th, it will be one of the things that we will be pushing for. Just one small thing. If you go onto websites and you try and look at courses on offer at sixth form colleges and tertiary education, very, very rarely is there any indication of which courses are suitable for which people with particular abilities or lack of ability. And it just shows it's a symptom of a deeper malaise, which is that, you know, it's just not geared, people are just not thinking about the issue, it's just not geared to people who have, you know, some kind of disability, whether it's visual impairment or whatever it is. It's not really, you can see that the heart's not there. I think we do need to, it's not just the legislation and this type of thing, it's also how we, there's also a cultural question here as well. As far as that, I mean, that's why, you know, my main point is that we do need a stronger legal framework to ensure that primary and secondary education is it's equal access for all. We've got a long way to go. It's not very simple, really, is it? Because you've got lots of different sorts of disabilities and so on. So it is a complex thing to deal with. But we mustn't just leave this in the hands of the civil servant to sort out. We need strong consultation. We need practical kind of examples of how to deal with individual problems.
Rachel?
And DSA?
same students' allowance?
Sorry? Yeah, well, it's inadequate at the moment, to be honest, because the question is, there are additional costs and there are difficulties. I mean, what my party's policy on the detail of that is, I confess I can't remember having read anything specific. It might be there because there's a lot of it, but I'll get back to you on it. I've got your contact details.
The Green Party's philosophy when it comes to education is that people are not economic units. You don't go to school to earn as much money as possible for your employer. You go to school to become a full human being who can live a satisfying life. So, and the problem with treating people as economic units is that people with disabilities and children with disabilities are seen as second-class citizens because they're not going to earn as much money for the economy, so the government believes, as other people. So we know that that is inhuman and it's discriminatory. And we would properly implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that this government has already signed but is not complying with. We want to see properly inclusive education with disabled children having as much right to learn alongside their peers as anyone else. And part of this is, speaking from my own experience, in my childhood, I have experience of both the state system and I have also been privately educated. And what I saw in private schools was a complete lack of children with any disabilities whatsoever. But in the state schools where I learned, there were actually disabled children there, so I was able to see what life was like for kids with disabilities. And I want that back again. And I want to end tax breaks for private schools and end free schools and academies so that no child is ever left behind and all children, no matter what their ability, learn together, because the Green Party believes that that makes for a better life for everybody. Not just a life that earns the most money, but a life that is really rich.
Stephen?
What's your policy on TFA?
Oh, I believe we would maintain.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us all and giving us this opportunity. And like to me, I hope we'll get a date before we leave for the visit, the journey on public education. I think we can get that in the diary before we go. It's good to make sure that it happens. Can I just mention one other thing which hasn't come up today, which I just thought was worth mentioning, because Paul touched on this a minute ago. We think that disability hate crimes should be specifically separate in the criminal justice system. And when there is somebody who is responsible for, as a perpetrator of a disability hate crime, we think that should explicitly be flagged on their record as something that they've done. Because we think that much more needs to be done to protect people.
Just because the question is about education, can you
Sorry,
relate
education.
that to education?
Yes, certainly,
as well,
I will. Well, I'm not in a position to answer today the series of proposals that the campaign has put in the leaflet, which I don't know if you've given all of us, but you've given me earlier on. I will certainly take that away and aim to come back with a written response to all of those. One point I would make, though, is that I am very, very firmly committed to the principle that wherever it is possible, young people with disabilities should be in mainstream education, and the support to enable them to flourish in mainstream education should be provided to make it work. And to fly the flag a little bit again for Newham. Newham was a pioneer in this area. Linda Jordan was our chair of education, was the mother of a child with a learning disability, and felt really strongly that children whatever their disability, should be in mainstream education, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think what the campaign is pointing out is that there are some consequences for that in terms of resources and support that need to be delivered to make it work, and I agree. On the disabled students allowance, we are committed to reviewing the future of the disabled students allowance were we to be successful at the election. Can I mention one other thing which isn't about education before I close? Very quickly, because we haven't had a chance to talk to her about social security. And the thing that really frightens me from the point of view of disabled people is the Tory party proposal, and this is not a Lib Dem proposal, it's separately it's Tory, to take £12 billion out of the social security budget over the next 2 years. And I don't think it is possible to do that without hammering disabled people. That's my great fear. Of course, they haven't told us how the £12 billion is going to be paid up, but it seems to me there's no way of doing it without having a terrible impact on disabled people. And I think all of us need to unite and say to the Tories, don't do it, because the consequences will be awful.
And if we just come back so that everybody else can have a chance to make a point about social security. So, Rachel, if you'd like to...
Yeah. I'll make it quick. The Green Party believes in properly supporting those who don't have a job or are unable to work. We're looking at the basic income policy that will enable people to raise children without having to go out and look for work. We are committed to making sure that every disabled person is better off under Green administration. So we believe not in austerity, but in supporting people at the bottom of the pile to have decent lives.
Well, I don't ascribe to the Labour Party or the Conservative Party evil intent specifically, but I do share the fears about welfare cuts. We don't support this level of welfare cuts, neither do we support the profligate expenditure plans of the leader of the opposition. So, but it does concern us greatly. And the reason it concerns us greatly is because if you see the sort of avaricious way, the way in which the bedroom tax has been implemented, and you see how badly the whole thing has been managed, and how people with disabilities have had to go to interviews and be humiliated, and having benefits taken away. I mean, maybe there isn't evil intent there, but the way the thing has been implemented has been utterly appalling and a disgrace for a civilised country. So I do share those fears, and we don't support that level of budget cuts. But as you know, neither do we support the sort of mad spending spree, which is in the small print of the Labour Party's proposals for government.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on the bedroom tax. The concession is there for people with disabilities, but you know, again, the scaremongering that we get from the Labour Party about, you know, disabled people being the guys that are going to suffer at £12 billion worth of welfare.
Where will the 12 billion come from? Well, it's not from disabled people. Tell us.
Well, no. Well, look. I mean, you can look at our manifesto. Look at other areas where we're spending.
Stephen, please.
Well, Stephen, also, what we've got to look, what we're proud of is not putting people back on benefits. We're happy to cut them, get them back into work, and by creating 1,000 more jobs a day, that's a record we're proud of, not creating a generation of people that were on benefits under Labour. So for us, it's not about, it's not just about cutting the welfare system and that's it. It's about the package that we're proposing. We're proposing 3 million more apprenticeships. We're providing 2 million more apprenticeships in the life of this Parliament. We've created 1,000 more jobs. You know, unemployment's at a record low. And before we talk about zero-hour contracts, which I know you're going to bring up, 62 of your MPs, including the Shadow Chancellor, employed their staff on zero-hour contracts. So, you know, creating jobs and job creation for us is something we're proud of. And getting people off benefits and committing, which we have done, we're not going to cut the benefits to disabled people, but making cuts in welfare and promoting people getting back into work, owning their own houses and getting on the ladder, that for us is what's most important.
Thank you. Could we end up with getting a commitment from all of you to actually talk to disabled people on the ground about the real fears around social security? Because you said that the Labour Party are scaremongering. We don't feel like they're scaremongering. We generally are afraid of what is going to happen to our lives and our lifestyles.
Okay. Can I also, just on that point, what I would be more afraid of is if Ed Miliband comes into Parliament propped up by Nicola Sturgeon, within about 12 months the whole economy will collapse and we'll be literally in a humanitarian crisis like Greece. That's a reality. Well, if we go, let's look at...
I'm afraid we are going to have to call time now. We did run over time. I'm very sorry, I've been a terrible chairperson, but I wanted to make sure that everybody's question could be answered. Thank you.
Give her a chance. She's standing for a question.
Just to round up, I wanted to thank the candidates, Candy, for coming and up their time, and also for the audience for coming along. We've heard what they've got to say, we've voiced our concerns, and the next thing now is to vote on the 7th of May, which hasn't always been easy for disabled people. MenCap said 1 in 5 people with learning disabilities have been turned away from the polling station. Lots of wheelchair users, Trailblazer says, have gone, found a step, been told to make their secret ballot out on the street. So, who here, keep your hand up if you're going to vote on May the 7th? That's fantastic, I'm really glad. Please remember that having our voices heard in politics doesn't end at the ballot box. There's many more actions that you can take and transport forward. If you stay in touch with us, we'll be asking you to take some of those actions, and we will definitely be in touch with whoever is our MP on May the 8th and inviting you on a journey with our members. And now the new recorder is going to take a quick picture and a round of applause for our chair as well.